world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Wednesday, November 19th, as you are looking to this, and yesterday was a bad day for Donald Trump. It was a big day, but it was a bad day for Donald Trump. Now, what happened? Well, yesterday was the vote on releasing the Epstein files in the House of Representatives. And we expected it to be bad for Donald Trump, right? Now, when they had the discharge petition, we had to fight to get to 218 signatures to call for a vote. And you may remember during the government shutdown, Mike Johnson was keeping the House out of session, one, because he thought he was putting pressure on the Democrats, trying to get them to cave during the government shutdown, and two, he was trying to avoid swearing in Representative Grijalva, who would have been the 218th signature on the discharge petition. Now, the discharge petition was going around the Speaker of the House because he was refusing to bring a bill that would force the DOJ to release all of the Epstein files. He was refusing to bring that to the floor for a vote. So they went to the rules and said, okay, well, if we can get 218 signatures, we can go around Mike Johnson and we can get this to the floor. Now, 4 Republicans and all Democrats ultimately signed it to force a vote. And that happened last week, that they had all the signatures. And Mike Johnson said, well, we'll have the vote next week, which was now. And after they had the 218 signatures, we were hearing that 4, 5, 10 Republicans were going to break ranks and vote for it. Suddenly, after a day or two, it sounded like there was 40 to 60, maybe even 100 that were going to break ranks. Then over the weekend, Donald Trump comes out and says, yeah, go ahead, just vote for it. Go ahead and vote for it. It's fine. I want you to vote for it. Okay. Well, I think he was expecting to be able to buy himself some time. He knew this was going to be bad. He was trying to get out in front of the Epstein files because he's desperate. He does not want them to see the light of day, and he does not want them to be able to be released. He wants to find a way to excuse it, to do something with it, because he is trying to buy himself just more time. So he thought, okay, I'll get him to send it over to the Senate. The Senate will bury it for me. Well, what happened when they voted on it in the House of Representatives? Well, they voted on it yesterday, and the yes votes just kept coming. And then there was momentarily a 1 no vote from a Democrat. And that seemed weird. But then pretty soon that was flipped. And then the yes votes just continued to pile in. Ultimately, they passed it in the House of Representatives, 427 yes to 1 opposed. And that 1 no vote was Clay Higgins, a Republican from Louisiana. Now, why did Clay Higgins vote against it? Well, he voted against it because he said, well, the House Oversight Committee is already looking into the Epstein files. This is going to hurt their investigation. You know, we need to protect their investigation and that kind of thing. That was his big takeaway from it. He was trying to save face that way. Well, turns out it didn't work. Okay. He didn't save any face that way. He should have just voted in favor of it. It was basically unanimous in the House of Representatives. Now, you may remember last week, they tried to pass it with unanimous consent in the House of Representatives. And at the time they tried to pass it, This was before the public outcry had come out and before the members of the House had started to slowly break ranks. And it got shot down for unanimous consent. And everyone was saying, well, the Democrats killed it on unanimous consent. They don't really want the files released. And that was never the case. That was never about releasing the files. The Epstein file, the unanimous consent idea was a way to just say, okay, we just all agree, even though not everybody necessarily agreed. What Democrats were hoping to do is not how it actually played out, but what they were kind of hoping for and how it looked like at the time. They had to fight and pull teeth to get to the 218 signatures to vote, even to have the vote on the discharge petition, right? It was looking like it was going to just pass with 218. So that when they held that vote, it was probably going to be something like 218 to 200 or 218 to 210, I guess, is what it would have been, because there was 428 members of the House of Representatives that voted on it. Only one voted no. Well, it was looking like they were just going to get it over that finish line. And they didn't want to try to give Republicans an out because a bunch of them publicly were saying, they hadn't publicly committed to being a yes vote. And by just saying, well, we're going to put it through with unanimous consent, it takes all of the pressure off of the representatives. And they really thought that they were going to end up having no votes in the files. Now, I can already hear certain Republican commentators, MAGA supporters coming into the comments saying, well, see, all the Republicans voted in support of it. They voted in support of it. Why would you say they wanted to keep it hidden? Because if they didn't want to keep it hidden, why'd we have to go through the rigmarole of doing the discharge petition? Why did Mike Johnson keep the House out for 7 weeks during the government shutdown and refuse to swear in Representative Grijalva, who would have been the 218th signature on the discharge petition? We didn't need any of that. Mike Johnson could have just called this bill for a vote. They would have passed it with this margin on one vote. It would have been done. This pressure campaign was the reason it worked by having to go around the discharge petition or by using the discharge petition to go around Mike Johnson and publicly bashing Republicans to the point where they voted these numbers is the only way it got passed. You can say, well, we didn't need to do all this. No, we didn't. Republicans should have been at this point when the bill was introduced, like 3 months ago, 2 months ago, as they were fighting with it. Why did it take so long to get to 218 signatures on the discharge petition? If every Republican, except for Clay Higgins, including Mike Johnson, voted in favor of the resolution to force the DOJ to release the Epstein files, why did we have to go through all that process? Because they didn't really want to release the files. They were trying to keep it hidden. And up until this past weekend, even Donald Trump thought they had a chance of being able to keep the files hidden. It just didn't work. Once the snowball started going, Donald Trump tried to say, see, I told you there'd be that snowball. Let's everybody get out of the way. And he tried to change the narrative, right? So that's why he said, go ahead and vote for it. Because they already knew that, or he knew, or somebody around him was able to convince him, more likely, that if he didn't try to get out in front of this narrative, the fact of the Republican Party turning on him and the numbers we were hearing was going to be politically bad for him. So he is trying to establish this as it was his idea to release the Epstein files. Now, he ran on releasing the Epstein files in the election, but he didn't want them released. He wanted to do what they tried to do this administration. They ran on releasing the Epstein files. He put Pam Bondi in place. She comes out and says, yeah, they're on my desk. We're looking at them. There might be something to release in a couple of weeks. Well, a couple of weeks goes by, and She comes out and says, "Yeah, I looked at the files. There's nothing there. There's nothing there." Cash Patel comes out and says, "Yeah, Epstein didn't traffic these girls to anybody but himself and Ghislaine Maxwell." Again, doesn't make sense. But that Donald Trump was trying to do that. He thought he could win the election, put loyalists in place that would turn around and just say, "There is nothing to see here. Let's move on." And it didn't work. He has been trying to hide these files because he knows how damning they are going to be for him. Not that he is remorseful for anything he has done. He maintains he has done nothing wrong in the files, even though just the little bits we have that do have Donald Trump attached to it are pretty damning. And I'm not even talking about the email that mentions him and Bubba. I'm talking about the fact that there is one email in particular that says Donald Trump knew about the underage girls. And that there's another one that talks about Donald Trump being at one of Epstein's properties for a while with one of the underage girls. I believe it was for hours. This whole thing is bad for Donald Trump, and he's not going to be able to control this narrative. So it passes the House with this big margin, right? And, you don't typically see, especially since Donald Trump came into politics, it is rare that a bill passes with this kind of a margin, where you're talking all but one vote no. I mean, certain things do pass with unanimous consent, but even then, it is very hard to get that. Typically, there's multiple people that would say no, but it passes. Then Mike Johnson comes out and says, well, it's not a perfect bill. The Senate should fix it. And it should be up to John Thune to fix it, to bury it, or, to work on it. But he also said that the men, potentially, or maybe it was women, we don't know, the adults that were clients of Epstein, that all of those names should be redacted when the DOJ releases it. What? Why? Well, he claims they're victims of him too. No, they were clients. They weren't victims. It wasn't like uh, Jeffrey Epstein convinced him that all of these underage girls and possibly underage boys were of age. And oh, well, you know, it was all harmless mistake. No, there's a good chance a lot of them knew exactly what they were doing. And then because Epstein made a lot of money doing this, I guarantee you, not all of the money he made was from the trafficking side of it and the massages and everything else that was going on. I guarantee you, yes, maybe this is what he meant and he said it poorly, was that once they committed the acts, that Epstein was blackmailing them. Now that's possible, but that still doesn't make them a victim because prior to the blackmail, they were willing participants. In fact, we know some of them went multiple times. So Mike Johnson comes out and says all of this, okay? Says that John Thune needs to work on it, needs to fix the bill, which isn't the first time one chamber has passed a bill and said, well, it's not done, the other chamber needs to fix it. And then if they, when they take it up, they make the changes, it goes back and forth and it gets delayed forever. So it gets kicked over to the Senate. But what happened in the Senate? Well, the Senate did something that the House didn't do. They passed it with unanimous consent. And how unanimous consent basically works in either chamber is they get up and they read the bill and say, okay, we want to pass this with unanimous consent. Does anybody object? They have, a short period of time to be able to object and, go on. Nope. Nobody wanted to say no. Okay, it passed. It is now on its way to Donald Trump's desk. And Donald Trump is probably beside himself at this point because he was expecting that his bold move of kicking it, of telling the House to vote for it and getting it over to the Senate was going to buy him weeks, maybe months of debate and talking about it, and that, that they might even be able to use the filibuster on their side, all Democrats, and maybe not getting, because there's only 47 Democrats, they would need to get to 60. Maybe they couldn't get to the 60 votes and pass it around the filibuster. Donald Trump was really hoping this was going to be a major delay tactic, and it didn't work. It is now on its way to Donald Trump's desk for his signature. So this bill is on its way to Donald Trump's desk for his signature. Now, he has said he was going to sign it regardless. But when? Well, he has 10 days. He's on the clock. He has 10 days, not counting Sundays. So that would be what? Next Friday, next Saturday, something like that, a week from this coming Friday, Saturday. Um, where if he doesn't sign it, it would automatically become law. Now, what is he trying to do here? Well, we've got Thanksgiving coming up, right? And he is hoping, I think, he's going to let it sit on his desk indefinitely, or maybe he thinks he can do that. If not, if they have told him that he only has 10 days, he might wait until next week with Thanksgiving when Congress is going to be out of session and he is going to attempt to veto this. I think I would be surprised. Now, maybe he has signed this between by the time you're seeing this, and I just haven't seen it yet. But I do not expect him to sign this bill into law. Now, when he signs it, or when he vetoes it, I mean, it will go back to Congress. Now, if Congress is adjourned when he vetoes it and they don't come back, they only have so many days, and I think it might still be that 10-day window to override a presidential veto. And I think he is trying to use the holiday weekend or to his advantage, trying to get them to not override his veto. Why would he do that? I thought he wanted them to vote on releasing the files. I know that's what some people are going to be asking. Well, it's because he really doesn't want them released. We've talked about it. He's in the files. But see, if he can do this the right way in his mind, that'll buy him time. So he's got 10 days that he can sit on it, doesn't have to sign it. That'll buy him time to figure something out because Donald Trump thinks he's a genius and thinks if you give him enough time, he is going to come up with a winning strategy that is going to be absolutely brilliant that nobody's thought of before, and it will secure his victory. He's not that brilliant. He's kind of a dumb fuck. But he will never admit that because he doesn't realize it. So he's sitting on this. I think he's going to wait until next week, till after Congress leaves for the holidays. But see, they never fully adjourn. We've been talking about this. They do what is called a pro forma session. And those pro forma sessions are where every 3-ish days, somebody from both chambers goes into the chamber, gavels it in like they normally would, opens the chamber like they normally would, and they go, on the record, they say, assuming everybody is here, if there are no objections, we are going to stand adjourned for 3 more days. Effectively. I might have the wording wrong, but that is effectively what they say. And because there's no one there to object on the record, they gavel it back out. And it's one of those things where if no one is there to object and there's no one there to claim that there's not enough people there to actually do that, it stands. And they just go about their business. Now, why don't they adjourn? Because it changes how the powers of Congress work. Okay. One of the things that can happen with like adjourning in this case, if they fully adjourn and they're gone, Donald Trump cannot sign the bill. And instead of it becoming law, it's considered a veto. And it becomes what they call a pocket veto. And um, they would have to start the whole process over again. Okay, I don't know how many days they would have to come back from their adjournment to fix it. Um, but typically, if they're out, they're going to be, if they fully adjourned, they're going to be out for a while. And maybe that is the plan. Maybe Mike Johnson is going to actively adjourn the House and John Thune adjourn the Senate instead of doing these pro forma sessions like they've been doing to let Donald Trump get away with it. Now, that would be dumb because people like myself and other creators that know this and other political commentators, or and even hell, uh, politicians themselves, Democratic politicians, are going to call Republican leadership to task for it. So if Donald Trump vetoes it, what happens? Well, it would go back to Congress and they would have to pass it around his veto. Now, it takes 2/3 of both chambers to pass the bill around his veto. And you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, 427 to 1, that's damn near unanimous. And the Senate was unanimous. Isn't that enough? Yeah, if they vote the same way the next time. It's not an automatic. It's not, well, oh, you passed it with that many votes the first time. No, you have to have a second full vote. And now, depending on what happens, especially if Donald Trump vetoes it, has a change of heart, comes out publicly saying, go ahead and veto it, Republicans would be back in the same situation they were in before Donald Trump came out and publicly supported them to vote for the Epstein file release the first time. They'd have to make tough choices, and it would be about putting names on paper. Now, it's entirely possible they just turn around and repass it with the same majority they passed the last time because they know how politically bad it is going to be. This is going to be a real test for Donald Trump as far as his political power, because if he decides to try to play games and try to get this thing vetoed um, going into the holiday season, etc. But if he tries to veto it, because we know, and we're also going into the primary season, that these members of Congress are going to have to answer their voters, right? And if he tries to veto it and say, "Hey, go ahead and vote against it," they're going to have to decide. And this is the same spot they were in going into the vote, and they were looking at it going, "Shit, we got to break from Donald Trump." And we were hearing first it was just a few, then it was 40, then we heard 60, then we heard up to 100 Republicans were going to break. Well, if 100 Republicans do this again and they don't break the same way they did with the first vote trying to overturn his veto, that's still enough in the House of Representatives to overturn the veto. And how bad would it look for any of these members of Congress to come out, publicly vote for it the first time in these kind of margins, and then when it comes time to override a presidential veto, suddenly chicken out? Now, Donald Trump is, going to try to run this clock out. But if it passes around his veto, this is going to be a bad sign for Donald Trump that the Republican Party is getting ready to move on and move past Donald Trump, and that they are looking at what they can do without him. Now, I've been talking about it for a while. I think it is entirely possible that if he tries to veto it, they will still pass it around his veto, probably along the same margins we saw today. I don't see why it wouldn't pass. Hell, they may even skip the formality and just go unanimous consent in the House, because even Clay Higgins might say, fuck it. No one bought my argument anyway. No big deal. Let's just get it passed. Let's override his veto and be done. And it is hard to necessarily pass something around a presidential veto on purpose, right? The 2/3 majority is there because, well, while they want Congress to have the ability to overturn a veto, what they don't want is a situation where it is like you would have Congress situated like it is right now, with slim margins in both chambers. But say you had a Democrat as president, say Kamala Harris won the election, they would be able to pass everything they want around the presidential veto if it was just a majority. That's why the big majorities are there. But if they pass this around his veto, Donald Trump is going to start lashing out if he does veto it. And it's just going to be a sign of how much, the Republican Party is ready to move past Donald Trump. Now, one of the things I've been talking about that could happen with this is if, he vetoes it and they pass it around his veto, they could also start impeachment proceedings on Donald Trump. And why would they? Well, because of his connections to Epstein. And just by what we know, what has already come out, the idea of Donald Trump going down on somebody or something named Bubba, which I've heard some varying ideas. One of the ideas first came out was that it was Bill Clinton. Now, Jeff Epstein's brother, Mark, came out and said it's not Clinton. There's the rumor going around that it was Ghislaine Maxwell's horse named Bubba. And that's, something. There were some theories going around that it is a slang term for underage people, young girls, young boys. So maybe that's entirely possible. We're also hearing that there are pictures at the minimum of Donald Trump with underage girls that are topless. And there may be even worse than that in the files. But we are hearing with the whole thing with Bubba that Putin has copies, which means it's blackmailable. And they could decide to get rid of Donald Trump on the simple fact that it is possible that the president is being blackmailed by a foreign leader. It's possible. Now, that's if you believe what is in these files, but they weren't necessarily very subtle about what they were doing, right? Sounds like these emails are, they weren't talking in major code or anything like that. So the Republicans could decide to move from Donald Trump, and they may use the files as their way to move away from Donald Trump and move on to J.D. Vance. Now, they were probably hoping that they could get by till after the midterms, but this may not give them that opportunity. They were hoping they could use Donald Trump and his popularity to keep the MAGA base going through the midterms and then move on after that so J.D. Vance could, in their minds, get the last 2 years of Donald Trump's term and then up to 2 terms of his own, that, he's going to be so popular, it's going to work, he's going to get elected, everything's going to be rainbows, unicorns, and sunshine. Well, J.D. Vance doesn't have a chance in 28. We keep talking about it. But I could see them wanting to attempt that. But they may be left with no choice but to impeach and remove Donald Trump ahead, if for nothing else than the simple fact that it looks like he's compromised. And if they do that, and if Republicans lead the charge in an impeachment effort going forward, I guarantee you they're not going to introduce in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives a measure to impeach the Republican president, which would be introduced by a Republican, unless they know for sure that the Senate, which is also controlled by Republicans, has the votes necessary to remove the president. And that would mean, assuming potentially that all Democrats would side with it, or that they have talked to enough Democrats and enough Republicans combined, knowing that they would get to that 2/3 majority, that 67 votes. It is a very high bar. We have never removed anyone, I believe, with impeachment. I know we have never removed a president. We came close with Andrew Jackson after the Civil War. He got saved by 1 vote, but still, we've never done it. But I just don't see this Republican Party, or any party really for that matter, moving against their own president of their own party, no matter how bad he is, if they don't have the votes to remove him. Remember what happened to Nixon? Nixon gets investigated for Watergate, and it turned out the cover-up was worse than the crime itself. But when public outcry was bad enough and the Republican Party was ready to move on against Nixon, what did they do? They turned on Nixon and they went to him and said, hey, look, we have the votes to impeach and remove you. You would better resign. or else. And he did. Now, is Donald Trump going to resign? Probably not. He thinks he's the Teflon Don, that he can get away with anything, that he's going to be able to come up with a convincing argument to convince anybody of anything. He would probably force them to put him on trial. I just don't see that this Republican Party, or really any party for that matter, going against their own president, impeaching him, if they didn't know for sure they had the votes. And why would they remove him? Well, to set up J.D. Vance, to give J.D. Vance a chance going into 2028, trying to break free from the negative implications of Donald Trump and trying to reimagine the face of their party. Now, if we still had Nixon era Republicans, we wouldn't have gotten to this point. Donald Trump would have been removed January 2021 when he was impeached the second time after January 6th. They would have voted to remove him. It would have been done. End of story. But that's not where we are. This is what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with the Epstein files, and this could be the Republican vehicle to move past Donald Trump. And he is getting more and more terrified as this is coming forward. Now, like I said, he says he's going to sign it, but he says a lot of things. So can we really trust it? I don't know. We will have to see if he does and when he does. I still think he is playing out for the veto, and he is going to try to drag it out until Congress leaves town for the holidays, so they are not around to actually hold the vote. So Donald Trump is also terrified of these files coming out. We know he's freaking out. He wasn't expecting the vote to go the way it did, and the pressure is on. How do we know? Well, there was a reporter asking him questions about the Epstein files. And let me make sure I get this right here. This reporter asked him first, what is it? Mr. President, what did Jeffrey Epstein mean in his emails when he said you knew about the girls? Donald Trump responds, I know nothing about that. They would have announced that a long time ago. Jeffrey Epstein and I had a very bad relationship for many years. That was his initial response. Now, let's dig into that for a minute, and I'll get to the rest of where I was going with this. First of all, no, they wouldn't have released it years ago. Donald Trump says that because that is what he would have done. Donald Trump would have thrown it out there if he knew about it, if that said Bill Clinton, or if that said Barack Obama, or if that said Joe Biden, and he had it in his hands during the first administration, that would have been out immediately. Immediately. But see, then that he thinks everybody else thinks the way he does. Okay. We don't. But that's how he would act, because for him it's all about getting the narrative out there, painting his enemies or his opponents in bad light, and that's what he wants to do. Well, he doesn't even care if it's a true story. Remember, he got impeached the first time for withholding aid to Ukraine because he wanted them to announce an investigation into Joe Biden. And basically he said, well, I don't even care if it's a real investigation. Just announce it. Just announcing it'll be enough. It'll be politically beneficial to me. He doesn't care about whether or not it's true. If he even thought about something like this being there, he would have come out with it and ran with it. So he accuses others of doing that exact same thing. And then he says that Epstein and him had a very bad relationship for many years. But is that really true? In some of the information we've already seen be released from the Epstein files, we've seen that he has admitted to knowing Epstein, or that he had, in the emails that have come out, we have seen that him and Epstein have been together well after Donald Trump claims to have broken away from Epstein. He claims that it was in the early 2000s, yet during Donald Trump's first term, we find out that as late as 2017, Donald Trump had Thanksgiving dinner with Epstein, that they were coordinating flight paths and stuff for Epstein's plane around when Donald Trump's plane would be flying into and out of Miami, I believe it was, or Palm Beach. Um, because when Donald Trump was in Florida, Epstein was there, etc. Seems like he really had a better relationship than what he wants you to believe, but he is saying that. Well, then apparently the he Donald Trump had moved on to the next reporter. That same reporter that asked him that first question said had tried to ask for a follow up question, and he put his finger out at her and goes, "Quiet, quiet, piggy." Really? That's how he's going to talk to a female reporter, calling her piggy. That's who he is, right? It's the personal insults. But this tells you he's getting terrified. He's worried about what is coming up. And he doesn't have an answer for any of this. His deflection isn't working. So it's just quiet, quiet, piggy. And that's what he said. Now, if we saw that by somebody, out in public. The example I saw was you're standing in line at the grocery store, and the cashier is getting talked to that way by a male customer. A lot of us are going to step in and say something. Hey, there's no need to talk to him like that. Something like that. You aren't going to defend it. But now MAGA's going to come out and defend him talking to that reporter that way. And this isn't the first time he's talked down to reporters. One of the things that anybody but Donald Trump would have gotten crucified for, and maybe that's a bad choice of words considering how MAGA treats Donald Trump as some sort of a messiah, but it would have been the end of their political career. Donald Trump made fun of a disabled reporter during campaigning for his first term. And I mean, the video clip is still out there. He has no tact. He doesn't care about people or their feelings or anything like that. And he just wants to bully and pressure people, and anybody but Donald Trump would have been canceled over this. Now, maybe being the active president, or the active president, I should say, Donald Trump wouldn't be removed for just that. But Congress and other members, other politicians and other members of the Republican Party would have come out strongly in the past. If this had been Joe Biden, the Democrats would have been out all over Joe Biden for treating a reporter like that. And no one is saying anything from the Republican Party. So either they condone it, they don't care, or it's just another example of, well, we can't reel him in. We can't do anything. Donald Trump is desperate to get away from all of this, and the way he's lashing out and everything is just showing how cornered these Epstein files are making him. Now, one of the things we've been talking a lot about has been the gerrymandering that has been going on in order to fix certain voting districts, etc. And how it started with Texas and the Republicans trying to get rid of 5 democratically held voting districts and trying to say, okay, we want to make it so they are majority Republican. And they passed it. They didn't put it up to a vote or anything else. They just passed it through their legislature. And they said, okay, these are our new maps. We are getting rid of 5 Democratic controlled districts. And they're doing it by moving their voters around, basically, by redrawing the maps into weird shapes, saying, well, we know this district over here or this precinct in this district votes like 65% Republican. Well, if we take those voters out and move them over here, and we take this district that votes 65% Democrat and move them over here, instead of winning that one district over there by 70% of the vote, we'll win it with 53% of the vote, and we'll win this democratically controlled district too. And they thought they were doing something, and that they could have gotten 5 more seats that way. Well, an appeals court today comes out and says, or not an appeals court, a federal court, with a judge that Donald Trump appointed, and said, Texas, those maps you passed, they are racially gerrymandered, and they are illegal. Can't use them. Got to use the ones you passed in 2021. Now, what does this mean? Well, of course they're going to appeal it. Now they're saying that they may try to appeal it straight to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court may decline it, not because they disagree with any of it, but because um, they might say, well, you got to go through the appellate court first. And because they haven't appealed it to the appellate court, that could be the problem there. Um, they may end up, we don't know how the Supreme Court is going to decide. Now, uh, obviously, they're going to try to challenge these maps with uh, or this ruling from the judge saying that the maps were unconstitutional and that they're illegally racially gerrymandered. Now, the Supreme Court has held in previous cases that the maps can be gerrymandered as long as it's not based on, race or things like that. If it is just based on political affiliation, then they're perfectly fine. And why is that important? Well, the distinction this judge made is it is based on race. And one of the things they looked at is where they were carving up districts, and it was a lot of minority areas. Beyond that, you also look at, does the state have a history of racially gerrymandering? With Texas, the answer to that is resounding yes. So then they say, well, it's probably likely that this was race based in some way, shape, or form. And why is that important? Well, that is their basis for overturning these maps. And the Supreme Court, like I was saying, has said, well, if it's just politically, redistricting, and it is all based on political party, that that is perfectly fine. Now, I disagree with that, and I think we need to do something like maybe a constitutional amendment that would prevent gerrymandering. I think all states should have something similar to what Iowa has, which is an independent commission. I know California had that as well, where they basically divide the state up evenly between the four or however many districts you need. And of course, you have to avoid things like dividing it up based on race. But if you just do it bipartisan and independent of politics, I think that is far better. Now, what they are saying, though, with these Texas maps is that they are an illegal gerrymander based on race. And if this holds, that means their efforts to redistrict Texas will have failed. Now, what does that mean for California? Well, California is attempting to redistrict in part because of that voter backed initiative that passed with like 67% of the vote. Doesn't mean it is not problematic. Now, the DOJ is suing California over their attempts to redistrict, but not Texas. Why? Because Donald Trump wanted Texas to redistrict. And now all of the complaints against Texas are coming from groups inside of Texas that say, hey, we didn't want to do this, or it's illegally, racially gerrymandered, etc. But with California, the DOJ's complaint is that it is illegally, racially gerrymandered. Now, they're going to look at it when the judge does finally look at this, but it's not really gerrymandered based on race. And California doesn't have that history of racial gerrymandering. So this is a big loss for the Republicans. Now, should California go through with this redistricting? I mean, by the time this court case plays out, it may be too late for them not to. They may have to go through with it in time for next year's election. I mean, we only have today's the 19th, so we've got 42 days left this year. And then pretty much beginning of next year, we are starting pretty quick into January where we're getting into primary season, starting to talk about primary challengers and primary debates and primary elections. I think some of the primaries are as early as March. There's going to be deadlines coming up where they have to have names in for these primary elections, and they have to have the ballots drawn up and all sorts of things. There's just not going to be a lot of time if California doesn't go forward with doing this, um, and say Texas wins its appeal. There wouldn't be the time if California said, "Oh, I'm going to back off. We're going to wait. We're going to see how the court case plays out." Well, they may not have the time to finish all of it if they wait. So they should probably go through with it just to play on the safe side. But here's one of the things about the difference between Texas and California when it comes to this redistricting plan. There's several key things. First of all, this Texas plan is permanent, okay? And that is, well, it is permanent as long as the census doesn't change allotment of congressional seats. Because if the census comes out like they did a couple of years ago, and because of population, they said, hey, Montana's finally big enough, Montana got a second seat. That seat had to come from somewhere. They didn't just get added because the number of members of Congress still sits at 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. Just because Montana was big enough now to get a second seat, they didn't just go, okay, well, we're going to be at 436 in the House now. That's not how that works. So assuming population doesn't change and Texas doesn't lose a seat, then these maps that they just passed, if this court case or this court ruling gets overturned and they get to use their horribly gerrymandered maps, they would be in effect permanently. They would go on past it. California, their maps only go until the next census, which is 2030. And then in 2031, after the census is done, they would redraw their maps if they need to based on number. But then they are going to go back to the independent commission that they had and redraw them fair. So some of these democratically held seats may be going back to being running again, in what would be considered a majority Republican district after 2030, after the midterms. Now, one of the things I talk about a lot is that Democrats, if they were worried about getting reelected, if they just do things that are good for people, they'll get reelected all the time. But the problem is they never message it well enough. So if they keep passing things that are good for people between now and when the redistricting of California would be over, they would just get reelected, and that it would their district, even though it may be a different shape now and cover some different people, they're doing good things. They would still potentially get reelected. The other issue, and the main difference between Texas and California on this, is that Texas, their voters didn't have a say. You could argue that Texas voters had a say when they elected the Republican majority in their state legislature. But this idea was never put to the voters. California took it to the voters and it passed with a supermajority. Now, doesn't necessarily mean it is correct, but it's at least better than what Texas did. So 2028 or 2026 could be an interesting election with these midterms. Now you got the Texas maps that are not going to be allowed to be used, California getting redrawn, not counting any of the gerrymandering. I still think that the Democrats could take the House by 40 to 50 seats, and they could even flip the Senate. And that would be bad news for Donald Trump because, he wouldn't be able to get anything accomplished. So we'll see how this all plays out. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about is Donald Trump was doing a press event with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in the Oval Office, and a Saudi reporter was asking Donald Trump some questions about his sleep patterns. because when Donald Trump was in Saudi Arabia um, earlier this year, he made a comment about how the crown prince doesn't sleep, is always up talking and thinking about his country and doing things like that. And Donald Trump says he's basically the same, that he never sleeps. Now, based on his late night Truth Social postings, etc., I mean, that sounds exactly like what he's describing, is he doesn't sleep at night. But I know several people who are up there in years, um, who are around Donald Trump's age, who are also suffering from some issues similar to what Donald Trump is suffering from. And we are thinking Donald Trump maybe has had strokes based on numerous things that we've seen, the face drooping, the slurred speech, the inability to control his leg. It looked like he was dragging his foot. Now, I've talked about that before. Certain types of strokes, depending on where they are at in the brain, when when it happens, you lose the ability to land heel first with that leg, and kind of roll your foot off to the ball and press off like what you normally would do. It does look like you are more or less dragging the foot around. Um, Sometimes people who have those kind of issues, they no longer would be able to lift their leg high enough to get into, say, a regular bathtub. That's why you see things like the commercials for the walk-in shower or the walk-in tubs that have the handle and the door, etc. You know, that kind of thing. Um, and those are for more than people who've just had strokes. It was just an example I'm giving here. But we think Donald Trump is having major issues. But one of the other things associated with dementia and strokes and stuff is an off-cycle sleep pattern, right? You get out of a circadian rhythm, you don't sleep at night. Um, and I know there are people who are overnight workers who don't sleep at night anyway, and I'm not talking about them. This is somebody who spent his life in the business world having to be awake during the standard 9 to 5 business day doing all of these things, and then you would assume would be sleeping at night. But he's up all hours of the night posting all kinds of crap out on True Social and other social media. You know, oh, this came across and I just thought of it. I'm out rage tweeting. Well, Donald Trump is, says in this question or whatever, he was asked about his sleep pattern. And he says, well, he doesn't sleep. He basically never sleeps, that he's always up thinking about our country and trying to make things better and everything like that. Except I don't buy it. I buy the fact he's not sleeping, and I don't buy that he's thinking about the country or trying to make things better. I think he is thinking about how to make things better for himself, right? He's trying to find ways away from and out of the Epstein files. Um, he's worried about being able to, sink or not get away from the sinking economy and try to divert and distract away from all of it. And it's not working. But he says he never sleeps, but yet we catch him all the time. And he tried to say that Joe Biden had the record for sleeping and, oh, he was always asleep and this and that. But you never caught images of Joe Biden sleeping in public. We've seen it. We've seen Donald Trump be, giving a talk or whatever and kind of jolt himself awake like that. It reminds me of older people that I've known that were suffering from similar problems to what we see with Donald Trump. And, when they start to doze, they jolt themselves awake and, oh, I was never sleeping. Or you'll be sitting there talking to them for a while. And all of a sudden, you're just talking. Maybe they aren't active in the conversation. Maybe it's multiple people and they're sitting in a comfortable chair. All of a sudden, they're out. 20 minutes later, go by, they wake up, act like they weren't even sleeping. Oh, I wasn't sleeping. But it happens, and it's a sign of somebody with Donald Trump's advanced age. He is 79 years old. But if you ask him, he is still in every bit of good shape that he was in his 20s. And I don't buy that. Nobody does. So he tries telling the crown prince that he doesn't sleep and, oh, he's in the best shape. And we've seen the proof. Okay. He does get caught sleeping in public. He may not sleep at night. He just finds other ways to nap throughout the day, Um, and people like him, that is a typical symptom of the health concerns we already have for Donald Trump. This doesn't help build his case. And I meant to mention this earlier, talking about everything with the Epstein files. Now, I'm going to touch on this briefly because we're getting near the end here. But a lot of people are concerned that they've somehow scrubbed the files or that they are going to try to claim ongoing investigation. Well, if they try claiming an ongoing investigation, like Pam Bondi says, well, we're looking into the Democrats that are in the list. Well, Donald Trump came out with that Truth Social post directing Pam Bondi to do just that. And he gave her a list of people to go after, much like what they can do with James Comey, Letitia James. They're going to have an easy time proving malicious prosecution. But if this law says they must release the files, the DOJ could get sued. And when they can try to use that as their uh, excuse in court, they can pull up that tweet and say, or Truth Social post, whatever you want to call it, and say, look, this is a sham investigation brought forward at the direction of the president. It's going to be vindictive prosecution, and we need access to these files. Now, you could potentially get it through maybe a Freedom of Information Act. Does a private citizen go after it? Maybe. Or could it be the news media? Could the news media be the ones that go through and try to force the release? So if they try to do some shady shenanigans, there are ways they can do it. And as far as the files being scrubbed, well, that's why the House Oversight Committee is still doing its job, right? Multiple places have copies of these files. The DOJ's copies aren't the only ones in existence. So when this order comes out, with if Donald Trump does sign it or it gets passed around his veto, however this plays out, when it does come out, and they try to block it or they try to redact all Republicans or Donald Trump or whoever from it, other places are going to have access to some of these files. And you have what is coming out from the Oversight Committee. Like, look at what just came out over the weekend. Democrats on the Oversight Committee went, yeah, hey, look, here are some emails that specifically mention Donald Trump. They're not going to be able to keep all of this hidden. It's not like everything referencing Donald Trump is just in one page in one document that they can go shred and be done and move on. There's too much information and too many other people have copies of what is going on. Not to mention that if there are shenanigans, several Republicans, including Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene, have said, well, if they try shenanigans to keep these files from being released now that it's passed, they will be on the House floor and they will basically read a list of names that were compiled by the victims of Epstein. And they will talk about it on the House floor. Why the House floor? Because they can't be sued. There's the speech and debate clause that you can't be sued for anything you say during speech and debate on the House floor or the Senate floor while doing your job as a member of Congress. So they couldn't be attempted to be sued for defamation or anything like that. And that is the last thing anybody wants because, well, it wouldn't be as damning as getting the files. Every one of those names is going to get ran through the ringer, which is exactly what should happen. So this is going to be far from over. I just don't think they are capable enough, competent enough to actively scrub them all, and nor are they going to be able to get rid of all of the copies from everywhere. Other people, and we're even hearing Vladimir Putin has some of the information. I mean, he could ultimately do, if the tide turns against Donald Trump, he may ultimately release what he has just because Donald Trump is no longer going to be his useful idiot. So this is going to be far from over, even if they try to do some funny business. There are other ways around it. All right, so that is going to do it for the Analytical Iowan podcast for today. I'll be back tomorrow because there's always stuff to talk about. We always have things going on. I hope you have a good day, and we will talk again tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.